a new settlement, there's a new name, and it's called Shimon HaTzadik. But just underneath us, it's hard to see in the dark, but just where you see the cars parking over there, and to the right, there's a grave of Shimon. Shimon HaTzadik, and Tzadik in Hebrew means righteous. So Shimon the righteous, who was an important religious figure during the end or the beginning of the Second Temple period time. End of the first, beginning of the Second Temple period time. During that time, he was the high priest in the temple. This was the time when Alexander the Great came into Jerusalem. So one of the few stories that's known about Shimon HaTzadik is that he greeted Alexander the Great on behalf of the Jewish community. And the fable goes that Alexander the Great got off his horse and bowed down before him, and they asked him why. And he said, you know, when I was winning my big battles in the battlefield, I saw this figure of this big priest in front of my eyes. Otherwise, we don't know so much about Shimon HaTzadik, except he's quoted in the Book of Fathers. It's like an external book to the Bible that just sort of Jews read. And in it, he's quoted as saying that the whole world stands on three pillars: Torah, Avodah, and Chasadim. Torah is the Bible, the spiritual practice. Avodah is work, toil, but can also be religious work. And Gemilut Chasadim means charity. So the whole world stands on these three pillars. And according to the Jewish tradition, he was buried just over there. And it's been excavated, and there are ancient graves there. Who knows if it's his or not. But in any case, by the Jewish tradition, like we talked in the morning, the soul of the deceased hovers around the grave, and if it's the soul of a righteous person, then if you go and you pray to him, he'll be, he's closer to God, so he'll take your prayer up to God, and that's why these places become often very important places for prayer. And so Jews have been praying there for many hundreds of years under the Ottoman rule, and later under the British. And during the Ottoman times, the group in charge here, which was a sort of weighty group of Jews in Jerusalem, the Sephardic community, the Jews of Spain, they leased the portion of land around the grave from the Ottomans. And they built a synagogue there, and they had a small neighborhood living next to the grave. Now, of course, in 1948, when the city was divided, east and west, the Jewish community went west. They no longer had access to the grave, but they regained access in 1967. After East Jerusalem came under Israeli control, they could now access it. Now, during this time, in the 1950s, the Jordanian government, which was ruling here, built homes in this neighborhood for Palestinian refugees from the 1948 war, who, for exchange for their refugee status and for a very symbolic $1 dinar a year, received housing here in Sheikh Jarrah. It was built by them and the UN. So those people have been living there from 56 till 67. And when the Israeli government came, initially they were able to just live there, and eventually the Sephardic Trust tried to reclaim the land. They were able to register a very large piece of land under their name. And after that began a series of legal attempts to get the Palestinians living on the land to recognize their ownership of this Jewish group. Now, these went all through the 1970s to the 1980s. Not much was happening. Palestinians refused to recognize the ownership. Courts continued until in the early 80s, an Israeli lawyer on behalf of the Palestinian community, their lawyer, here they signed an agreement with this group, Sephardic Trust, and the agreement was that they would recognize, the Palestinians would recognize the ownership of the Sephardic Trust, and in exchange would be given a protected resident status. So they paid a small sum and could stay in their houses. Some of the families signed on to the agreement, some of them rejected it. Later on, all the families rejected the agreement. They argued that they didn't understand exactly what they were signing, or they were cheated by the lawyer. And the court cases continued. Until in the early 2000s, a very radical settler NGO called the Halat Shimon bought the rights to administer the land from the Sephardic Trust, and they started using much more